The afternoon started like 100 others. I was standing in the shade beside a half-framed community center, looking over a set of plans while a cement mixer turned somewhere behind me. The air smelled like dust, cut lumber, and hot asphalt. My foreman was beside me, tapping one calloused finger against the corner of the page, walking me through a minor change near the rear entrance. That was when my phone rang. It was my wife, Erin. I answered with my usual, "Hey, what's going on?" She sounded tired, not upset, just worn thin in that quiet way hospital shifts can do to a person. She told me one of the nurses had called out again, and she needed coverage through the evening. Then she asked whether my father could keep the kids for a few hours. I remember looking out across the site instead of answering right away. The welders were throwing small blue sparks at the far end. A radio was playing somewhere, low and scratchy. One of the younger guys was carrying a stack of drywall in careful little steps. Everything around me felt ordinary, steady, but I still didn't answer right away. "My dad can do it," I said at last. "I'll take them by there on the way home." There was a pause. Then Erin thanked me and said she'd make it up to me over the weekend. After I hung up, I slipped the phone back into my pocket and tried to return to the plans. I couldn't. A few days later, I would be sitting at my kitchen table with a manila folder open in front of me, staring at bank deposits, property records, and a photograph I wished I had never seen. But at that moment, all I had was a low feeling I couldn't explain. So I folded the plans, handed them back to my foreman, and told him I'd check in later. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 36 then, and I ran a small construction company outside Tulsa. Nothing flashy. A few trucks, a rented yard, and a crew made up mostly of men other companies wouldn't hire. Some had records. Some were in recovery. A few had spent enough time being judged that they no longer expected kindness from anybody. I understood them. My father used to say I had a habit of collecting strays. He never meant it kindly. I had 2 kids. Ava was 11, old enough to notice things adults wished children would miss. My son, Ben, had just turned 2 and moved through the world like every room had been designed for him alone. Erin worked long shifts at the county hospital. I built things for a living. Between us, we kept the house running and the lights on, and most days that felt like enough. My father, Harold Mercer, lived alone on a patch of land about 20 minutes outside town. He was 63, still lean, still upright, still carrying himself like every conversation was something to win. He had raised me after my mother died, and he had done it with rules, criticism, and the kind of silence that made a child study the room before speaking. He believed that made boys strong. I believed it made them careful. At 3 o'clock, I picked Ava up from school. She climbed into the truck, dropped her backpack at her feet, and pushed loose hair behind one ear without looking at me. "How was your day?" I asked. "Regular," she said. That was her word when she didn't feel like explaining things. Sunlight came in hard through the windshield. The cab was warm, and the truck smelled faintly like sawdust and coffee. At the next light, I told her we had to pick up Ben and stop by Grandpa Harold's for a few hours because her mom got held late at work. Ava turned and looked out her window. The pause was small, but I noticed it. "Do we have to?" she asked. I kept my eyes on the road. "It's just for a little while. I could stay home with Ben." "Not yet." She nodded once, but she didn't look convinced. Her fingers worried at the zipper on her hoodie. I asked what that was about, and she said, "Nothing," in a tone that told me it wasn't nothing. We picked Ben up from daycare a few minutes later. He came running across the room in those soft, fast toddler steps, one shoelace untied, cheeks pink from play. When I lifted him, he wrapped both arms around my neck and pressed his face against my shoulder like he'd been gone a week. I remember that part very clearly. We reached my father's place a little after 4. His house sat back from the road behind a long gravel drive, with an old equipment shed off to one side and a stand of cottonwoods behind the fence line. The yard looked dry and still in the late light. My father came out before I had fully shut off the engine. He stood on the porch, one hand resting on the rail, waiting. When I opened Ava's door, she didn't get out right away. "Dad," she said quietly. I leaned down. "What is it?" She glanced toward the porch, then back at me. "Can you come back early?" I gave her a small smile and told her I would. Then I took Ben from his car seat, grabbed the diaper bag, and walked both children up toward the house, with my father waiting at the top of the steps in the thin, flat light. Then I waited. My father opened the front door before I reached it. He gave Ben a quick look, then took the diaper bag from my hand without offering to help with anything else. That was his way. efficient when it suited him, distant the rest of the time. "Long day?" he asked. "Long enough," I said. He nodded once and looked past me toward the truck, where Ava was just stepping out. The air smelled like dry grass and old wood. Somewhere behind the house, a metal gate knocked lightly in the wind. I remember Ben reaching for the collar of my shirt while I shifted him on my arm, and I remember Ava coming up the steps slower than usual. My father noticed too. "She all right?" he asked. "She's fine," I said. Ava moved closer to me instead of going inside. She had one hand curled around the strap of her backpack, and her shoulders were set in a way I had seen before only when she was trying not to show she felt uncomfortable. My father held the door open. "She can sit and read," he said. "The boy can play in the den." I told him Ben had already had a snack, that Aaron would be home late, and that I would be back by 6:30. While I was talking, I saw Ava glance up at me again. It was quick, easy to miss if you didn't know her. I leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "It's just a few hours," I said quietly. She nodded. Ben was already reaching toward the hallway, distracted by a small wooden truck my father kept on a shelf for when children visited. I set him down, and he ran toward it without hesitation. That should have reassured me. It didn't. I said goodbye, stepped back onto the porch, and walked toward my truck. Halfway down the steps, I turned to look behind me. Ava was standing in the entryway, not moving. Ben was on the floor with the truck in both hands. My father had one hand on the inside doorknob. The screen caught the light and made the whole scene look slightly washed out, like an old photograph. Then the door closed. I drove back toward town, telling myself I was reading too much into nothing. That was an old habit too. When you grow up around someone unpredictable, you learn how to smooth over your own instincts. You explain things away. You say he's old now, or he's set in his ways, or maybe that's not what he meant. You become very good at making discomfort sound unreasonable. I stopped at a hardware store a few miles from the site to pick up fasteners and some electrical boxes we needed for the next morning. Inside, the air conditioning was too cold after the heat outside. The place smelled like rubber mats, fertilizer, and machine oil. I took a cart and moved through the aisles, checking things off in my head. Box of anchors, exterior screws, junction covers, normal work, normal evening. I had just reached for a pack of masonry bits when my phone started vibrating in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw Ava's name on the screen. I answered right away. "Hey, kiddo." All I heard at first was breathing, fast and uneven. Then she said, "Dad, please come home now." Her voice was low, but it had that thin, strained sound people get when they're trying not to cry and failing anyway. I stopped moving. "What happened?" She took a breath that broke in the middle. "Grandpa took Ben upstairs." I waited, not because I wasn't alarmed, because I knew if I filled the silence too quickly, she might lose the thread of what she was trying to say. "What do you mean?" I asked. "He told me to stay downstairs." Her words were coming faster now. "Ben was crying, and I went to see, and he told me to go back down, and I didn't, and she stopped. In the background, I thought I heard movement. Maybe a floorboard, maybe a door. Then her voice changed. Small, tight. "He's doing something wrong." My hand tightened around the phone. "Ava," I said, as evenly as I could, "listen to me. Are you with your brother right now?" "No, can you get to him?" "I don't know." My cart was still beside me. I left it where it was and started walking fast toward the front of the store. "What exactly did you see?" I only saw part of it. She was crying openly now, trying to stay quiet. "Dad, please. Please just come." I was already outside by then. The late sun hit me hard, and the heat felt different all at once, sharper somehow. My keys were in my hand before I reached the truck. "I'm on my way," I said. "Stay on the phone with me." She said, "Okay," but it came out thin and shaky. Then another sound came through the line. A man's voice, too far away to make out words, but close enough to change everything. Ava gasped. The line went dead. I stood there for one still second with the phone at my ear, listening to nothing. Then I got in the truck and started the engine. I called back before I had even pulled out of the parking lot. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. Then I called my father. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I put the phone on the passenger seat, shifted into drive, and headed for the highway. The truck hit the first turn harder than it should have. A horn sounded somewhere behind me. I barely heard it. What I remember most from that drive is how quiet my own mind became. Not calm, just clear. People think fear feels loud. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it narrows everything down to a short list. Get there. Get the kids. See what is real. I called my father 2 more times. Nothing. Then I called Ava again. This time she answered, but she didn't speak right away. Ava. I heard her breathing. A muffled sound, like she had one hand over her mouth. Where are you? In the bathroom. Is the door locked? Yes. Where is Ben? A pause. Upstairs. My grip on the wheel tightened, but my voice stayed level. Did Grandpa see you call me? I don't know. Listen carefully. Don't come out unless you hear me. Not his voice. Mine. Do you understand? Yes. If he knocks, you say your stomach hurts. Nothing else. Another soft, okay. Then, very quietly, Dad. I'm here. She took a shaky breath. Please hurry. I am. I ended the call only because I needed both hands. The sun was dropping lower by then, flattening the fields into strips of dull gold and shadow. I passed a feed store, a church sign, a row of mailboxes, the same landmarks I had driven by for years without thinking. Everything looked exactly like it had looked the day before, and I remember thinking how offensive that felt. At some point I ran a red light. At another I took the shoulder around a truck that was turning too slowly for what I could tolerate. I am not proud of that drive. I'm just telling it the way it happened. By the time I turned onto my father's road, the sky had started to thin into evening. His house came into view through the trees, still and neat and ordinary. No sign of urgency, no movement in the yard. I pulled in so fast the gravel kicked up under the truck. The front door was shut. I got out and crossed the porch in 3 strides. I hit the bell once, then pounded on the door hard enough to rattle the glass. Dad. No answer. I tried the knob. Locked. I stepped back and looked through the narrow window beside the door. The front room was empty. Lamp on. Chair in its usual place. Nothing out of order. I hit the door again. Still nothing. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Until then, part of me had still been reaching for an explanation that would make the rest of this smaller. A misunderstanding. A bad read. A frightened child connecting the wrong dots. But locked door, no answer. Crying daughter hidden in a bathroom, son upstairs, phone calls ignored. Those were not feelings. Those were facts. And facts are easier to work with. I walked back down the steps, opened the truck, and took out the short pry bar I kept behind the seat for job site crates and paint lids. Then I came back up, slid it into the frame near the latch, and leaned my weight into it once, twice. The wood split on the 3rd try. The door gave inward with a sharp crack. Inside, the house smelled like furniture polish, coffee gone stale in a pot, and something medicinal underneath it. I called out for Ava and Ben as I moved through the front room. My boots sounded too loud on the hardwood. No answer from downstairs. Then I heard it. A small cry from above me. Ben's voice. I took the stairs fast, one hand on the railing just to keep from slipping. Halfway up, I heard another sound. A quick movement, maybe someone crossing a room, then silence again. At the top of the stairs, the hall was dim. My father kept the blinds half drawn in the evenings, and the light came through in narrow bars across the floor. His bedroom door was open a few inches. That was where the sound had come from. I pushed the door all the way open and stepped inside. Ben was on the bed. His shirt had been pulled off, and he was crying in that tired, panicked way toddlers do when they no longer understand what's happening. My father was standing beside him, one hand turned toward a tube of cream on the nightstand. Ava was near the far wall, pale and rigid, her phone still in her hand. For 1 second, no one moved. Then I crossed the room, lifted Ben off the bed, and settled him against my shoulder. He clung to me immediately, hot-faced and shaking. I could feel his breath catching against my neck. "What is this?" I asked. I wasn't loud. That seemed to surprise my father more than anything. He straightened a little and looked at me with open irritation, as though I had interrupted a routine task. "The boy has a rash." I looked down. There was redness across Ben's stomach. Heat rash, maybe. Contact irritation. Something real, but not serious from what I could see in that moment. "You took him upstairs," I said. "Yes." "You told Ava to stay downstairs." She was hovering. I turned to Ava. "Come here." She moved right away, crossing the room in 2 fast steps and stopping beside me, so close her shoulder touched my arm. She didn't look at my father once. Then I looked back at him. "Why didn't you answer your phone?" He gave the smallest shrug. "It was downstairs." Ben was still crying softly into my shirt. I kept one hand on his back and looked around the room. Cream on the nightstand. Drawer half open. Lamp on. Bedspread pulled unevenly. My father's face completely controlled now, but not warm, not apologetic, not confused. Annoyed. That was the word. At being questioned. At being interrupted. At having the moment broken. I was putting ointment on him, he said. That's all this is. Maybe that was all it was. Maybe it wasn't. But one thing had already become clear to me. I was done asking the situation to make me comfortable before I acted. I shifted Ben higher on my shoulder and kept my voice flat. We're leaving. My father's expression changed then, just slightly. Daniel, we're leaving, I said again. Ava was already moving toward the doorway. He took one step forward. You are letting an 11-year-old child turn this into something foolish. I met his eyes. No, I said. I'm letting her tell me she felt unsafe, and I'm listening. The room went very still after that. Then I waited. My father did not move aside right away. He stood near the bed with one hand resting on the edge of the mattress, looking at me as if I were the one making the room difficult. Ben had quieted a little, but every few seconds his body gave a small hitch against my shoulder. Ava stayed close at my side. I could feel how tense she was without even looking at her. You're overreacting, my father said. Maybe, I said. We're still leaving. He let out a breath through his nose. Not anger exactly. More like disappointment that I had become inconvenient. Then he stepped back just enough for Ava to pass into the hall. I carried Ben downstairs. Ava went ahead of me, moving quickly now, grabbing the diaper bag from the kitchen chair and Ben's shoes from beside the sofa. I noticed details because that is what I do when something matters. My father's phone was on the counter. Face down. The back door was latched. A dish towel had been folded with sharp corners beside the sink. Everything in the house looked precise and controlled. Too controlled. At the front door, my father spoke again. You are going to regret making a scene out of this. I opened the damaged door the rest of the way. Evening air came in warm and dry. I'm not making a scene, I said. I'm making a decision. He followed us onto the porch. Ava went straight to the truck and climbed in. I buckled Ben into his seat, then shut the door gently so I could turn back and face my father without either child hearing every word. He stood under the porch light that had just clicked on, one hand in his pocket now. The light sharpened the lines in his face. This is exactly why children get confused, he said. Too much softness. Too much suspicion. Your wife fills that house with nerves, and then a child misreads one moment. And suddenly, I'm being treated like a criminal. I did not answer right away. There are times when silence helps you hear what the other person is trying to protect. I watched him instead. No concern about Ava crying. No question about Ben. No effort to step toward repair. Just a steady attempt to define what I had seen before I could define it for myself. That mattered. I'll be in touch, I said. His expression hardened. About what? About whether you'll be seeing my children again. For the first time, I saw a flash of something under the surface. Not shame. Not fear exactly. More like calculation. He recovered quickly. You really want to do this? I opened the driver's door. Yes, I said. I do. Then I got in, started the truck, and backed down the drive without looking at him again. We drove in silence for several minutes. The sky had gone a soft gray blue, and the first lights were coming on in houses along the road. Ben had begun to drift from crying into exhausted little hiccups. Ava sat forward in her seat, both hands wrapped around her phone, staring out the windshield as if she needed to keep watch. I did not head home right away. Instead, I pulled into the lot of a small convenience store near the highway and parked under a light by the ice machine. The place was busy enough to feel safe. A couple of men in work boots stood near the entrance with paper cups of coffee. Someone was filling up a truck at Pump 4. A woman was loading groceries into the back of an SUV 2 rows over. Routine. Witnesses. Light. I turned in my seat and looked at Ava. Tell me from the beginning. She swallowed and nodded. Her voice was steadier now, but only because she was working at it. She told me my father had been unusually pleasant when we first arrived. He gave Ben cookies. He told Ava she could watch television in the front room. Then, after a few minutes, Ben started crying. My father picked him up and carried him upstairs. When Ava followed, he turned and told her to go back down. His voice was normal, she said. That's what made it weird. I asked her what she meant. She rubbed her thumb over the side of her phone and kept her eyes on the dashboard. When people are doing something they don't want you to ask about, sometimes they sound extra normal. That was not a sentence I wanted to hear from my daughter. So I waited, she said. Then I went upstairs anyway. She told me the bedroom door had not been fully closed. Through the gap, she could see Ben on the bed, crying, and my father standing over him. She said she saw his shirt being lifted off. She heard my father say, "Hold still," in a voice she did not like. Then she backed away, went into the bathroom down the hall, and called me. "Did you see him touch Ben anywhere besides his shirt?" I asked. She looked down at her hands. "I don't know. I got scared." "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to fill in anything you didn't see. That is important, especially with children. You do not hand them words. You let them keep their own." I took a breath and nodded once, mostly to myself. Step 1. Get both children checked and documented. Step 2. Write down the timeline while it was still fresh. Step 3. Stop all contact until I had facts, not explanations. I have learned that fear becomes more manageable when it is given structure. I took my work notebook from the center console and flipped to a clean page. Under the yellow lot light, I wrote the time I picked Ava up from school, the daycare pickup, arrival at my father's house, the time of Ava's call, my missed calls to him, my arrival, what I saw in the bedroom, the cream on the nightstand, his exact words as best as I could remember them. Then I asked Ava for the times on her phone. She showed me the call log with trembling fingers. I copied each one down carefully. Ben had gone quiet in the back seat. I turned and looked at him. His eyes were half closed, his cheeks still damp. I unbuckled enough to check the rash under the cab light. Red, blotchy, irritated. Real, but not urgent. Not something that required secrecy. I wrote that down too. Then I took out my own phone and called Erin. She answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said, sounding distracted. "I've only got a minute. Is everything okay?" I looked through the windshield at the store windows reflecting the lot lights back at me. "No," I said. "It's not." Her voice changed immediately. "Are the kids hurt?" "Not physically, I don't think. But I need you to listen and not interrupt me." So I told her. Not every emotion. Not my guesses. Just the sequence. Pick up. Drop off. Ava's call. The locked door. The bedroom. Ben on the bed. The rash. My father's explanation. When I finished, there was a silence on the line that felt very precise. Then Erin said, "Take Ben to urgent care tonight." I know. And Ava needs her own account written down exactly as she remembers it. I'm doing that now. Another pause. Then, very quietly, "He does not see them again." "No," I said. "He doesn't." She let out one breath. I could hear hospital sounds faintly behind her. A cart moving. Someone calling a name. Shoes on a polished floor. "I'm leaving as soon as I can," she said. "Text me where you are after urgent care." "I will." I ended the call and put the phone face down. Then I turned back to Ava. "You did the right thing," I said. She nodded, but her face folded anyway. She started crying in that exhausted, embarrassed way older kids cry when they do not want to be treated like babies. I reached over, and she leaned toward me just enough for me to rest a hand on the back of her head for a few seconds. Then I sat up again and started the truck. We drove to urgent care on the other side of town, where the waiting room smelled like sanitizer and old coffee, and the television in the corner was playing a cooking show with the sound turned too low to follow. At the front desk, I gave our names, our insurance card, and a clean version of the truth. "My son has a rash," I said, "and I need it documented tonight." The woman behind the desk looked up at me for one extra second, then nodded and started typing. Then I waited. Urgent care took a little over an hour. Long enough for Ben to fall asleep against my chest in the plastic chair. Long enough for Ava to stop crying and go still. Long enough for me to read the same wall poster about seasonal allergies 3 times without taking in a word. When the nurse finally called us back, I carried Ben into the exam room and set him on the paper-covered table. The room was cold. It smelled like disinfectant and hand soap. Ava sat in the corner chair with both feet tucked under her, watching everything. The physician assistant was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a calm voice. She examined the rash, asked when I first noticed it, asked whether he had a fever, and asked if there had been any new detergent, food, or soap. Then she looked at me and said, "You mentioned at intake that you wanted careful documentation." "Yes," I said. Her expression stayed neutral. "Tell me what happened." So I did. Again, I kept it factual. My father watched the children. My daughter called me in distress. I returned and found my son on a bed upstairs with his shirt removed. My father said he was applying cream for a rash. The door had been closed most of the way. My daughter had felt frightened enough to hide and call me. The physician assistant listened without interrupting. Then she asked Ava, gently, whether she wanted to add anything. Ava gave a shorter version of what she had already told me. No embellishment. No prompting. Just enough. The woman nodded and wrote it all down. She examined Ben a second time, more thoroughly. She said the rash looked consistent with skin irritation, likely not serious, and that she did not see any obvious physical injury. Then she said the sentence I had been expecting. That doesn't answer every concern. No, I said. It doesn't. She met my eyes for a moment and understood that I knew exactly what she meant. Before we left, I asked for the visit summary and a copy of the notes as soon as they were available through the portal. She said they would be uploaded by morning. I thanked her, gathered the kids, and walked them back out through the waiting room, where the television was still on and the coffee still smelled burnt. By the time we got home, Erin was already there. Her car was in the driveway, kitchen light on, front porch lamp on too. When I opened the door, she met us in the entry hall still wearing scrubs under a cardigan, her hair tied back, face drawn with the kind of focus that comes when a person is holding themselves together on purpose. She kissed Ava first, then took Ben from my arms as carefully as if he were made of glass. Go wash up, she said softly to Ava. Then pajamas. Ava nodded and headed down the hall without arguing. Erin waited until she was gone before looking at me. How bad? I don't know yet. She held my gaze for another second. That's honest. We put both kids to bed in our room that night without discussion. Ben curled into the middle of the mattress with a stuffed dog under one arm. Ava lay on top of the blanket at first, fully dressed, claiming she wasn't tired. 20 minutes later, she was asleep with one hand resting near her brother's foot. When the house finally went quiet, Erin and I went to the kitchen. I laid out what I had on the table. My notebook with the timeline, the urgent care paperwork, screenshots of the call log from Ava's phone, missed calls from mine to my father, timestamps, short notes, no speeches, no guesses. That was the first real shift. The moment the evening stopped being only a family crisis and became a record, Erin sat across from me, reading each page in silence. The refrigerator hummed. The dishwasher still held clean dishes from the morning. A porch moth kept hitting the window over the sink with a soft tapping sound. Finally, she said, "We need one more layer between us and him." I know. Tomorrow I want the pediatric records saved, copies printed, and the school informed that he is not authorized for pickup under any circumstance. I nodded. She added, "And I want this written up cleanly. Chronological, not emotional." It already is. She looked at the notebook again and gave a tired little nod. Good. I put the phone face down. Then I called a man named Russell Pike. A few years earlier, he had helped me with a contractor fraud issue involving forged delivery receipts and a subcontractor who thought deleting emails solved everything. Russell was not flashy. He was careful. Former insurance investigator, now private work. Good with records, property searches, and public filings. Better with silence. He answered on the fourth ring. "Daniel, I need you to look into someone." There was a short pause. Personal or business? Both, maybe. That was enough for him to hear the seriousness in it. Who? I looked at the paperwork spread across my kitchen table and said, "My father." He did not react right away. That made me trust him more. "What am I looking for?" he asked. "Anything that tells me whether what happened tonight stands alone." A quiet breath on the other end. "Then, send me his full legal name, date of birth, current address, and any business entities you know of. I'll start with property, filings, civil records, nonprofit associations, banking patterns if I can get indirect visibility, vehicle registrations, and old permits. No promises beyond what the paper will give. That's enough." "It usually is," he said. After I ended the call, I emailed in the details from my laptop right there at the table. Name, address, former company name, approximate retirement date, known property, a few old associates I remembered from my teenage years. Men who used to come by job sites and linger too long over coffee while they talked quietly with my father in the driveway. Then I printed hard copies of everything. One set went into a file folder. One set went into the small home safe in the laundry room. One set stayed on the table while I worked. Step 1, secure records. Step 2, lock down access to the children. Step 3, wait for independent information. I did not say those steps out loud. I just followed them. At 11:18 p.m., my phone lit up. Unknown number. I opened the message and read it once. You should have handled this privately. No name, no signature, no other text. I did not reply. Instead, I took a screenshot, saved it to the folder, emailed it to myself, and forwarded it to Russell with one line. Received tonight. Preserve. Erin saw my face and held out her hand. I passed her the phone. She read the message, then set the phone down very gently. That's not confusion, she said. No, that's pressure. Yes. She looked toward the hallway where the children were sleeping. Then we stopped treating this like family tension. I nodded once. The next morning, I started making calls before sunrise. The school principal first. Calm, direct, no extra detail beyond what she needed. My father was not allowed contact, pickup, visitation, or access to information. Then daycare. Then the pediatric office for record requests. Then my bank, because my father's old company had once held a small administrative tie to an equipment account that had crossed over into a family guarantor years earlier. I wanted every shared thread cut, even old ones. By 8:30, our house felt less like a home and more like a command post. That may sound cold, but cold was useful. At 10:07 a.m., Russell called back. I've only done the surface pass, he said, but there's enough here to keep going. I picked up a pen. Go ahead. Your father has one recently purchased property outside state records tied directly to him. But there's also a secondary rural parcel held under an LLC that maps back to a registered agent who appears in 2 other nonprofits. One of those nonprofits dissolved 18 months ago after licensing complaints. The other is still active. What kind of nonprofit? Youth Transition Housing. I wrote that down. He continued. Board overlap includes a retired family court judge and a man who used to run a private group home. Neither has a clean pattern if you look at complaints, closures, and timing. Timing of what? Children moved between systems. Cases going quiet. Too many administrative dead ends. He paused. It's not proof, but it's not random. The kitchen felt very still around me. You have documents? I asked. I have filings, deed transfers, articles of incorporation, and some tax forms. I'm sending them now. There's also one thing you need to see in person. What thing? A storage facility rental tied to the LLC. Current. Paid 6 months ahead. I looked at the clock on the stove. When can you meet? An hour. I ended the call, printed the first batch of documents as they hit my email, and spread them across the table beside the urgent care notes. Addresses, entity names, signature blocks, dates, a retired judge's name, a former director of youth housing, mailing overlaps, a cash-heavy pattern in one set of filings that did not match the stated operations. Erin came in, read the first page over my shoulder, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked, "Are you still thinking this was only about a rash?" "No," I said. She rested one hand on the chair back. "Then don't meet anyone alone." "I won't." At 11:32, I was sitting across from Russell in a quiet back booth at a diner off the service road. He slid a folder across the table to me without introduction. Inside were printed records, photos of a rural gate, a storage unit ledger, and 3 pages of payment logs. His finger tapped one column. Cash equivalents. Repeating amounts. Irregular but patterned. Then he tapped a name I recognized from one of the nonprofits. This man signed for 2 deliveries to the storage unit in the last month. I looked at the signatures, the dates, the unit number, the grainy camera stills. Then I waited. Russell let me read everything in silence. That was one of the reasons I had called him. He did not rush people toward conclusions. He trusted paper, dates, repetition, signatures. Once you have enough of those, the truth usually stops needing help. The diner was half full. Coffee cups clinked somewhere behind me. A waitress was wiping down the counter with slow circles of a damp cloth. It was an ordinary morning in an ordinary place, and I was looking at records tied to my father that no longer fit any harmless explanation. The storage unit had been rented under an LLC that traced back, in layers, to the same small network Russell had flagged the night before. The payment history was uneven, mostly money orders. The access log showed regular entry over 6 months, almost always late afternoon or early evening. 2 of the approved names on the file matched the nonprofit documents. One was the former group home operator. The other was a man I remembered from my father's old jobs years earlier, someone who always seemed to arrive after dark and leave before coffee had cooled. Russell slid over 3 grainy surveillance stills from the facility office. Not great quality, but enough. "This one is your father," he said. It was. Hat low, shoulders squared, carrying a banker's box. In the second image, he was walking beside the retired judge. The third showed a cargo van backed near the unit door with the plate mostly obscured by glare. I asked, "How solid is the chain?" "Solid enough if law enforcement moves quickly. Weak enough that it can still disappear if someone gets warned." That was the sentence that decided the next hour. Up to then, I had been holding 2 competing ideas in my head. One was the part of me that wanted to keep building quietly until there was nothing left to question. The other was the part that understood delay had its own risks. Records can be shredded. Units can be emptied. Phones can be replaced. People who are used to systems know exactly how to buy themselves time. I looked down at the access log again. "Who has this besides you?" I asked. "Nobody." "And the facility?" "They have the originals, plus digital records." I nodded. Then I made 3 decisions. First, I would not confront my father again directly. Second, I would not let this sit another night. Third, I would walk it in through a channel that created a record the moment I spoke. I put the folder back in order. Russell watched me for a second and understood. "You're ready to hand it over," he said. "Yes." He nodded once. That's the right call. Maybe it was. Maybe it was just the only call left that still belonged to the world of rules. I paid for both coffees, took the folder, and drove straight to a field office downtown where a former client of mine, now a city contracts auditor, had once told me to bring anything involving nonprofit shell entities and interstate movement if I ever stumbled into it. He had said it casually at the time. I had never expected to use the advice. I did not go in asking for a favor. I went in asking for a receipt. That matters. The woman at the federal intake desk wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke in a low, practiced voice. I told her I had documents involving possible fraudulent nonprofit activity, property concealment, and circumstances around a child welfare concern tied to named individuals. I asked for the name of the person receiving the material. I asked what case reference would be assigned. I asked how to preserve a civilian copy. She looked at the folder, then at me, then made a call. 23 minutes later, I was in a plain conference room with a special agent and another woman from an investigations unit that handled financial crimes connected to charitable organizations. I recognized one thing immediately. Neither of them was interested in my emotions. That was fine. I had not brought emotions. I laid everything out in sequence. My written timeline from the prior evening. Ava's call logs. The urgent care documentation. The unknown text message. The property records. The LLC filings. The board overlap between the nonprofits. The storage unit logs and still images. I spoke slowly and let the documents do most of the work. The agent stopped me only to ask exact questions. "When did you first restrict contact?" "Last evening." "When was this message received?" 11:18 p.m. "Has there been prior unexplained contact from these individuals?" "Not documented by me." "Did your daughter describe physical contact beyond removal of the shirt?" "No." She stopped at what she saw and heard. He nodded at that, which I appreciated. Careful statements matter. Then the financial investigator picked up one of the filings and asked Russell's first useful question all over again in different language. "Does your father have legitimate reason to be associated with this network of entities?" No, that answer was easy. They asked me to wait outside for a few minutes. I sat in a hard chair facing a wall with a framed emergency exit map and listened to office doors opening and closing somewhere down the hall. My phone buzzed once with a text from Aaron asking only, "How is it moving?" I answered, "It's moving through paper now." Then I waited. The agent came back with a different tone in his voice. Not warmer, just more definite. "They're securing the storage facility this afternoon," he said. "We're also freezing notice on the nonprofit accounts tied to these filings and issuing preservation requests. You may be contacted by child welfare investigators and possibly state police, depending on what turns up." I asked the only question that mattered first. "My children. We'll take statements in a way that minimizes disruption. In the meantime, keep them away from the individuals you named, and do not contact your father." I wasn't planning to. He held my gaze for a second. Good. By early evening, things began confirming each other. First, the storage unit. The agent called to say the unit had contained boxed records, phones, donor files, intake sheets from 2 transition organizations, and locked medical coolers with cereals that did not match any lawful chain they could immediately establish. Enough to support search warrants elsewhere. Enough to move fast. Then a second call came from a state investigator asking whether I could identify 3 names connected to my father's older contracting years. I could. 2 had shown up in Russell's board overlap notes. The third had signed one of the facility access logs. Then, just after 7, a final call. My father's rural parcel had been searched under warrant. There were records there too. Ledgers, transport notes, and a set of archived hard drives. No children on site. No immediate violence. But enough material, they said, to shift the case decisively from suspicion to organized criminal conduct involving fraud, coercion, and illegal medical brokerage. He had already left by the time officers arrived. That part did not surprise me. Men like my father often mistake foresight for wisdom. In truth, they usually just know how to leave early. He was not the only one. The retired judge had been taken in that afternoon. The former group home operator was picked up near the highway with 2 phones in his truck and a receipt book in the console. One nonprofit administrator had tried to close accounts online after the preservation order was served, which helped no one but the investigators. By 9 that night, the shape of it was visible. Not every answer, not every victim, not the full span of years, but enough. Enough documents, enough dates, enough names linked by process instead of rumor. When I finally got home, the house was quiet. Aaron had left a lamp on in the living room and a mug of tea for me under a plate to keep it warm. I sat at the kitchen table again. Only now the papers were in 2 stacks, what I had kept and what had already moved into evidence. Aaron came in wearing socks and one of my old shirts, sat across from me, and asked, "Is it real?" "Yes," I said. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "All of it. Enough of it." That was the truest answer I had. Over the next 2 weeks, the rest arrived the way truth often does in cases like that. Not in one grand reveal, but in confirmations. Search returns, account freezes, recovered messages, dates lined up across systems that had once looked separate. One witness cooperated after being shown signatures. Another turned over a ledger to save himself. A records custodian identified missing intake files. A shipping company confirmed repeat deliveries under fake descriptions. The timing of my father's property purchases lined up with nonprofit transfers and unexplained cash movement. The pattern held. There was no innocent version left. He was charged in absentia with conspiracy, fraud, coercion, and offenses tied to illegal procurement activity. Others were arrested. Some took plea deals quickly once they saw the storage records. Some tried to posture and failed under timelines that no longer bent for them. My father stayed gone. There was no dramatic showdown. No speech. No final call. Just forms filed, warrants served, statements taken, accounts frozen, and a case number that kept getting longer as more names were added to it. The school put a copy of the restriction notice in Ava's file. Daycare did the same for Ben. Our pediatrician flagged the chart. Aaron made a small folder for our home records and labeled it in neat black letters. I changed the locks, then changed the gate code, even though my father had never had it. I did not want memory holding open doors that paperwork had already closed. That was the real consequence. Not cinematic. Administrative. Permanent. One evening, near the end of that second week, Ava came into the kitchen while I was sorting mail and asked, "Is he coming back?" I set the envelopes down and gave her the answer a child can live inside. "No," I said. "Not to us." She thought about that, then nodded once. It was not healing, but it was a boundary, and sometimes that is where healing starts. Then I waited. The first quiet change in our house was the mornings. For a while after everything broke open, mornings had felt cautious. Not loud, just careful. Cabinet doors opened softer. Shoes were found earlier the night before. Ava checked the front window more than she used to. Ben wanted one of us in sight all the time, even if he was only stacking blocks on the rug. Then, little by little, the routine started feeling like routines again. I began waking up before everyone else, making coffee in the dark kitchen and standing at the sink while the machine finished its slow work. The house would still be dim then, just the light above the stove and the faint blue of early day at the windows. I got used to those minutes. Cup, counter, silence. Then I waited, not for danger, just for the rest of the house to wake up. Ava went back to school with a new pickup note on file and a counselor she could visit without asking permission in front of a classroom. Ben forgot more than we did, which I was grateful for. Erin stayed practical the whole way through, the way she always does when life gets rough. She color-coded the folders, scheduled what needed scheduling, and still somehow remembered to put clean pajamas at the foot of both beds on laundry nights. A few months later, I boxed up the last things I had kept from my father. Old photos, a pocket knife he once gave me, 2 letters from when I was in my 20s, a set of tools with his initials burned into the handles. I put them in a plastic bin, sealed the lid, and carried it out to the garage, not because I was erasing history, just because I wanted the house to belong fully to the people living in it. That felt different, cleaner. On Saturdays, I started taking Ben with me to the yard when I needed to sort materials or check a delivery. He wore a tiny pair of earmuffs and carried things that weighed almost nothing, fully convinced he was helping me run the place. Ava sometimes came too, usually with a book or headphones, though every now and then she'd walk the perimeter with me and ask questions about framing, measurements, permits, or why one kind of concrete set faster than another. I answered what she asked. I didn't rush her. That became a rule for me after all this. Don't force the pace of other people's healing. Make room. Keep things steady. Tell the truth simply. Repeat what is safe until it becomes ordinary again. The company changed too. Not all at once, and not because I gave a speech about it. I just got quieter about some things and more direct about others. We tightened hiring paperwork, added background support resources through a local partner, started reserving a few jobs each season for people aging out of foster care or coming out of recovery programs with verified work clearance. No spotlight, no announcement, just process. One afternoon, almost a year after that call from Ava, a 19-year-old named Lucas came by the yard asking if we were still hiring apprentices. He had a state-issued duffel bag, 2 good references from a church carpenter, and the cautious posture of someone who had been told no a lot. He said he had spent most of high school moving between placements and short-term housing. Good with electrical basics. Not much experience with people. I looked over his paperwork at the folding table in the office. Everything was in order. You can start Monday, I told him. He blinked once, like he hadn't expected the answer to come that fast. Then he nodded and said, "Okay," in a voice that tried very hard not to sound relieved. After he left, I stood in the doorway of the office for a minute with the hiring packet in my hand, looking out at the yard. Forklift moving slow near the fence. Pallets stacked square. A radio somewhere under the metal awning playing old country low enough that you could ignore it if you wanted to. There are people who slip toward the edge of bad systems every day without anyone noticing. Not because they are careless. Not because they are weak. Mostly because they are young, or alone, or tired, or easy for the wrong person to categorize. I notice them now. Maybe that is one useful thing I kept from all of this. Another quiet change came in the evenings. For years, I had ended most nights with noise in the background. Television, phone in my hand, truck radio still in my head from the drive home. Afterward, I found I wanted less of that. More simple things. Rinsing dishes, wiping counters, lining up lunch containers for the next day, locking the back door, and checking the stove knobs with my palm. Erin would make tea sometimes, and we would sit on the porch after the kids were asleep without saying much. That became enough. No victory in it. No big lesson hanging in the air. Just order, ownership, peace that had been rebuilt on purpose. One spring evening, Ava came outside while I was coiling the garden hose. She was taller by then, calmer too, though not in the forced way from before. She asked whether I thought people always became like the families they came from. I told her no. She waited. So I added, but I do think people become like the rules they keep. She thought about that for a while, then nodded once and went back inside. A few minutes later, I heard Ben laughing at something in the living room and Erin telling him to stop climbing the couch cushions like they were a mountain range. I finished coiling the hose, shut off the porch light, and went in. That's where I'll leave this. Not at the office. Not at a courthouse. Not with a file number or a charge sheet, even though those mattered. I'll leave it in the kitchen, with lunches packed, shoes by the door, and the house settled for the night. That's what all the paperwork was for in the end. Not revenge. Not drama, just the right to live a normal life without letting the wrong people define it. And I'll say one more thing before I go. A few months ago, a woman from 2 streets over asked if I knew anyone who could help her nephew find steady work. Quiet kid. Been through too much. Didn't trust older men much, she said, and kept checking locks before bed. I told her to send him by the yard on a Tuesday morning when things were slower. He hasn't come yet, but I keep a blank application in the top drawer, just in case. If this story stayed with you, I'd be glad if you'd like the video and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always like seeing where people are listening from. When this one ends, 2 popular stories will appear next, and I think you'll enjoy both.